communist, anarchist, reactionary, crazy, collapsitarian, soy boy, nativist, cave dweller, Luddite, Anabaptist. Anabaptist? What is this, the 19th century? The machine, the definition of it would be the system of technological progress that most of us take for granted and is leading us to a very certain and specific future.
This isn't just a modern day, what the iPhone has done to us kind of thing. It's looking at centuries of progress that has gotten us here.
I think the central question that we have to ask in this age of AI isn't what will the machines become? It is what will we become?
In the last year of the World War, the Tomanian nation began to weaken. Behind her lines, revolution had broken out. Her diplomats were frantically suing for peace, while at the front, Tomania's army fought on, confident its war machine was invincible, confident its war machine would smash the enemy's lines. Big Bertha, a cannon that could hurl a projectile 100 miles, was this day to make its first appearance on the Western Front. Was this day to strike terror into the hearts of the enemy. 75 miles away was her target, the Cathedral of Notre Dame.
That was an excellent monologue. I could not have done an accent like that.
Thank you, Zanita. Well, hello, everybody. My name's Jesse, and we are here today to talk about a tremendous film, a film that is largely forgotten, but when it was released, was celebrated by the masses and by the critics alike. That was possibly a strangled reenactment of the opening, but if you have never seen The Great Dictator, this is how the film opens. So the film opens in a sort of frantically war-like setting. So there's some real-world, I guess, implications there. So it starts with the World War, but there's this strange nation named Tomania, and at the very end, a reference to our world, the Great Cathedral of Notre Dame. And of course, the object of Big Bertha, which was a famous cannon used by the German Empire in World War I. So this is a tremendous film. The New York Times called this perhaps the most significant film ever produced. And Zanita, did you know this film was produced not by a great war correspondent or serious filmmaker, but by perhaps one of the least serious filmmakers of the early 20th century, and that is Charlie Chaplin himself?
Man, yeah, I actually, for the first time I saw this film, there used to be this like pizza lounge near my house, and they would play Charlie Chaplin on like a projector on the wall, and that was like their thing. Every night it'll be Charlie Chaplin, and you would get wood-fired pizza, and it was awesome. And I remember seeing a scene from this and just being like, wait, what's happening? Is this supposed to be Hitler? What's going on here? Like, this seems really serious. And having a conversation with people about this movie at this pizza lounge. But I think that was my first engagement with it. But I'd be curious to know from you, is this something you saw when you were young? Is this something you saw at school? Is this something you just saw recently in studying this film, or what was your first exposure to it?
I think my first exposure to it was YouTube, maybe, or Reddit. There's the famous scene that we're going to talk about because it's kind of the big sort of pathos piece of the climax. Really made its rounds on early YouTube, I think, in the early 2000s. I think that's where I first saw it. But of course, it is part of Charlie Chaplin's great film sort of body of work, and it is definitely the most unique out of all of his works. There is a definite Charlie Chaplin-esque style to the film. It is extremely funny. It is extremely slapstick, and the physical comedy is all there. But unlike a lot of his other work, it's also extremely serious and dark in many ways.
Yeah, is this what you would call the genre dark satire, or is this what you call slapstick, or
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if this is one of the first examples of dark
maybe?
comedy,
So the modern day
potentially.
Jojo Rabbit is what I'm imagining.
Yeah, that's definitely an apt description. Yeah, Jojo Rabbit is definitely, and I think Taika Waititi's comedic style is very much influenced by Charlie Chaplin's physical comedy.
Well, tell us why was it most or why was it so significant? Why was it coined the most
Yeah,
significant film ever produced?
yeah. So a little bit about the film. So Chaplin plays two characters. So he plays a soldier at the beginning of the film. He's a Jewish barber, and he never actually gets named. He's just the barber. But he also plays this other character named Adenoid Hinkle. And Adenoid Hinkle is a very thinly veiled parody of Adolf Hitler. And Tamania, the land that we find ourselves in the film, is very much based on Nazi Germany. The reference to the Cathedral of Notre Dame at the very beginning of the film is sort of like grounding us in the real world, but also grounding us in a sort of surrealist version of that real world. And if
Is
you were wondering,
Tasmania a real place?
no, no. So
Okay.
Tamania is very much just based on Germany.
I guess
I
it was
was
gonna be
actually
Romania, but
this is the thing. I've been trying to figure out why he chose the word Tomania. I'm sure there's a reason for it, but I haven't figured out the reason for it. So maybe it's just creativity. But if a listener knows the reason, please let us know. Um, so there's real world trappings, but it's a surrealist version of the real world. It's a parody version of real world, and in fact, at the beginning of the film, when Big Bertha shoots its load to try and destroy the Notre Dame Cathedral, instead of hitting the cathedral, it just destroys an outhouse in a local nearby farm. So, and then the second sort of shell casing that gets put into the cannon kind of flies out and then immediately drops to the ground. And then the barber kind of goes to inspect it, and then it starts to fizz, and it follows him around. And you can imagine the physical comedy of it. And then it kind of blows up, and everybody ducks for cover. And it's a lighthearted opening to what is ostensibly a serious film.
mm,
So I mentioned Adenoid Hinkle. Chaplin plays both these characters, and he's very much a sort of uh, parody of Hitler. But the rest of the cast is likewise made up of other parodies. So you have Hitler's on and off friend, Napoloni, which is supposed to be a parody of Mussolini. Or there's Garbage, which is Goebbels, or Herring, which is Hermann Goering. So these are all famous characters from the real world Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. So this is very much the tone of the film. It's
they're
it's
not
comedy, but it's
oh,
also very serious.
yeah. They're not really disguised, these characters, are they? They are kind of
No.
made known who they're supposed to be.
Yeah, I don't think subtlety is Chaplin's modus operandi, especially when it comes to this film. So yeah.
Alright, so it's comedy, but it's also very serious.
Yeah, so the film very much deals with themes of oppression and persecution. Chaplin doesn't disguise or try to create a different kind of identity for our main character, the barber. He is a Jew, and just like in Nazi Germany, the Jews get savagely persecuted in the film. And his friends and his family, many of them get shipped off to camps, and there's actual oppression, there's ambivalences, there's a character that he saves early on in the film. And part of the tension of the mid part of the film is, what do these characters who otherwise have nothing to fear from the Jews, how do they deal with this newfound oppression that they're being forced to, in many cases, to participate in? But sort of skipping to the end of the film, the climax is sort of the most, I guess, celebrated part of it, because it's where I guess Chaplin's mask falls off. And I guess to um, go behind the curtain a little bit, this film was made in the 1930s, 1940s. So this is very much set against the backdrop of World War II. This film came out before World War II had concluded, and so the the story of Hitler and the fall of Nazi Germany had not yet been written.
Mm.
Um, so
I feel like in some cases that would be, too close to home. Like, when there's a
yeah,
current world event going on and people make jokes, you're like, "Oh, a bit too soon." Like, we haven't quite healed from
yeah,
that. So I wonder how it was taken back then, whether it was, super controversial or whether people were mad about it or
yeah. Well, people were definitely mad about it. The Germans obviously weren't too happy about it,
yeah.
as were a lot of the allies for the Germans. But it was actually very well received
Mm,
across the rest of the world. Was shown in London and New York and became a hugely successful film. But you're
mm.
right in that it's a very strange way to produce and release a film while bombs are falling, while Europe is still being torn apart.
I feel like there are some quotes in this film that they kinda get brought up quite frequently, whether it's in, like, essays or other films or articles or whatever. So do you want to kind of lead us to those? What were some of those things that were said that you've drawn on in your article?
Yeah. So what essentially happens at the end of the movie is one thing I haven't mentioned is that these two characters that Charlie Chaplin plays look identical, pretty much identical, and that kind of makes sense. He probably doesn't even need to be said, but they are two people, one the dictator and one the Jewish barber, completely different people from completely different walks of life. But they look identical, and so at the end of the film, the two of them get mixed up. This is a classic comedy trope, right? The important man gets mixed up with the nobody. In this case, the persecuted Jew, and so uh, the barber, the Jewish barber, is hastily has his uniform put on and everything. He looks the part, and he is given the opportunity to give a victory speech because the Tomanians have just won this incredible victory, and so they rallying the troops, and he turns this entire speech on its head, and he directs a lot of it to the soldiers, the people who are participating in the regime. He doesn't necessarily address the leaders of the regime, which I think is really interesting. He addresses the other people, the people that are more like him, the everyday butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, the regular working class people, and he says to them that one of the really poignant lines is how dictators free themselves but enslave the people. So again, appealing to the working class. He says, "You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men." And then he goes on to quote from the Gospel of Luke: "The kingdom of God is within man, not one man, not a group of men, but in all men." This is to a group of people who has oppressed him and his people, his family, his friends, the people that he cares about. Um, and so he's taking this opportunity to appeal to their humanity. And I think this is very much in taking with Chaplin's own kind of ethos, especially when it comes to ordinary Germans, ordinary people within the Nazi regime who are just trying to live their life, who just want perhaps a normal life and have inevitably found themselves swept up in this great machine, this great regime that is causing so much damage across Europe.
Yeah, it's interesting that I guess they kind of paraphrase, like you said, that quote from the Gospel of Luke. But was Charlie Chaplin a religious person? Like, why was he bringing theological arguments into that
Mm.
whole script?
Well, I think this is a time when most people are just assumed to be religious. I think this
Mhm.
is, yeah, pre 1960s, kind of the rise of atheism is not as widespread. So I'm sure Chaplin had some religious convictions of his own, but I think as well he sees the parallels between the humanitarian efforts to appeal to the humanity of regular Germans and the teachings of Jesus being aligned. So it's not surprising that he appeals to the Sermon on the Mount to make his point here.
Yeah, okay. I think that that other quote, "You are not machines, you're not cattle, you're men," is also
Mm,
interesting because I think, this is this podcast episode is part of a series that we have done on AI basically and the future of AI 2027 and what's going to happen to us all. And I think a lot of us do feel like we are kind of just caught up in it and we don't have much choice or agency. We are just like, have got to go with whatever happens. And
mm,
we may be doomed or we may not be. But I feel like it is one of those things where it's like, we kind of do feel like cattle in that sense. Like we feel like we're just being led to doom, essentially.
mm. Well, there's a common phrase that gets bandied about a lot, which is, if the product is free, then you are the product,
Mm.
essentially. And a lot of us feel that way, whether it's just simply advertising on Facebook or Google, or, whether it's our data being scraped by Meta or Google again, or any number of other companies using it to sell more product.
Yeah, so where does it go from there? Do they kind of I mean, I feel like this isn't a film where they land with practical advice. But like what hope do they leave us with when we are like in this conversation?
So the film ends with this great appeal to, rise up and free the world from tyranny and from tyrants, to save the world and to save ourselves. And this is where the film ends. And I think it's interesting the film ends here because, as I said at the beginning, the war hadn't finished just yet. So there's still this hanging question over the end of the film, just as there was over the fate of Europe and the fate of Hitler and the Nazi regime and all that. And so I guess if I'm reading into it, I guess the hope that Chaplin is invoking here is to appeal to that common shared humanity, to find the future that we hope for, a future of peace. And as a work of propaganda, if you can use that term, I think it's pretty effective. And I don't mean that necessarily as a pejorative, but it is definitely a work of propaganda. The Nazis are obviously portrayed as the bad guys here, which is definitely has been vindicated by history. But as the war's going on, there would have been many people on both sides wondering about who the good guys and who the bad guys were. And I think it's just as much a critique today as it was back then.
Chaplin uses this line and he says, "Dictators free themselves but enslave the people." Can you unpack what that actually looked like in the context of Nazi Germany?
Yeah. So this directly goes into Hitler's claims about what he wanted to do for the German people and with the German people. And um, Nazism is very much based on the premise of race struggle, the idea that the struggle between the races, aka the Aryan race, and everybody else, but particularly the Jews, is an existential struggle, a struggle between diametrically opposed combatants, and one that will leave one utterly dominant and the other in complete ruins. And so in Hitler's writings, in Mein Kampf and his speeches and everything like that, this is a theme that runs its way throughout the entire Nazi regime. And so, because Hitler is able to portray the Nazi cause as an existential cause, he is able to do extraordinary things which otherwise would not have been possible. Uh, and so, what happens is, well, essentially the Nazi regime becomes a war and loot regime. So the quick annexation of countries like Austria to begin with, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Belgium, and then later France are vital to making the Nazi war machine run. And in order to do this, Hitler has to create enormous amounts of productivity. So the Rhineland is the sort of economic heart of Germany, and its factories are then stuffed full of people. Um, One of the interesting things that happens in the Nazi regime is that the economy is constantly teetering on a knife's edge. And what they have to do to many of these factories is issue essentially bonds or useless bits of paper that are then backed up by the Nazis because they don't actually have the money to pay these people, to pay these workers. And so you can cash in a check, you can cash in this piece of paper to get food or, flour, water, milk, butter, all these things that you need. Um, but it's all sort of a house of cards. It's sort of like fake money being created. And so what ends up happening is that you have this entire economy which seems incredibly strong, but has got a really shaky foundation, but then involves every member of the German society down to the last man, woman, and child. So, for instance, in the war effort, when Germany finally invades Belgium and France, they employ this blitzkrieg tactic, which basically involves pumping their soldiers full of methamphetamine so they don't have to sleep as long, so they can march for longer, so they don't have to eat as much. So you can have these incredibly vicious and quick engagements that take these, in many cases, ancient systems of defense completely by surprise and
Essentially, you turn
overwhelm.
people into a machine.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
you pump them full of drugs, and they're kind of not almost not human anymore.
Mhm.
Um, so this is crazy. So, and the other thing as well that women, many of them are kicked out of schools and they're not able to study as much. We talked about, I don't know if we talked about it on the podcast, but we had an article written a couple of years ago on Sophie Scholl, who was a member of the White Rose resistance group in Germany. And she was highly educated and she was part of the university system and found it really frustrating to be limited. So many women are limited in their ability to get an education. And their role is reframed within the Nazi regime to being mothers, to producing as many good Aryan children as they possibly can. Those children are then indoctrinated in Hitler Youth programs. And in Germany at this time, there are many programs that uh, were for your regular scout programs and things like that. But many of them are folded into the Hitler Youth program, and many other organizations are closed to make way for this huge sort of child youth indoctrination program. And then, of course, where it all leads to is another machine. And this is the concentration camp killing machine, the work camps, which is a kind of machine. This is, for the production of goods and services, and it is slave labor. And then that produces its own casualty rate. But then, of course, the systematic murder of 11 million Jews and gypsies and gay people, Mormons, political dissidents, more other groups that are targeted, the disabled, are then murdered in these gas chambers. And so when you put all of these pieces together, it's a machine. It's a very well oiled. It's an efficient machine, but it is ultimately a machine built on lies, both ideological lies as well as actual practical lies. Because if given the option, the machine would have burnt itself out. And the only way the machine worked was by the constant conquest and acquisition of stuff by the Nazis. So, in some ways, the Nazi race struggle is kind of a self fulfilling prophecy because the ideology says that in order to survive as a race, we need to conquer all peoples and assume supremacy over the entire globe. That's the ultimate aim. But on the other hand, in order to actually accomplish its ends, it needed to constantly loot in order to sustain the increasingly fragile and disconnected network that the machine eventually became.
Yeah, so the promise, I guess, laid out by Hitler was very different to what kind of unfolded. But when we look at like those things that you mentioned, like when the soldiers were fed, I guess, drugs to keep them going, to keep them up at night, when the women's education system kind of changed, when the indoctrination of the Hitler Youth happened, I'm guessing that wasn't framed, or maybe you can inform me of this. Was that like framed as something that would be beneficial and something that they kind of willingly did, or were there like consequences if they did not? adhere to
Mm.
those kind of suggestions or rules.
Well, there were definitely consequences if they didn't adhere to the rules. One thing I didn't write about in my article, but I think is important to note, this is going to sound really boring, but a lot of
It
top
is.
World War II historians basically say that World War II was won and lost on factories. Um,
Mm,
and the way, so if you think about it, if you've got two sides that are fighting and they're both producing stuff in factories, it makes sense that the side that is able to produce stuff more efficiently, more cheaply, and more quickly usually would have the advantage, right? That's pretty basic. And it is interesting that people often think about the German Nazi war machine as being this highly organized, highly efficient sort of machine. And in many ways, it was. Um, but in many ways, it was also very disorganized. So political infighting was rife in the Nazi regime, factionalism, all these sorts of things. Out trying to outdo each other in order to impress Hitler. So the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, was constantly fighting with the Navy or with the Army. You had the secret police constantly clashing with other factions, um, all these different special interest groups. And in fact, the same kind of messaging was happening in places like the UK and in the United States and Australia and New Zealand to a certain degree. It's just that Australia and New Zealand didn't have the manufacturing capabilities that the US and the UK did. So the UK and the US particularly in some ways also turned into a machine in this era, because you had these huge factories. I mean, some of the most enduring and kind of evocative imagery of the Second World War are these great posters of the sort of machinist women, in their overalls with their sort of bicep
Guns.
flexing, you can do it kind of thing,
Yeah.
getting into the factory, building shells or whatever. Um, that's what won the war. It
Mm,
was Britain's ability to trade with the United States and with other parts of the empire, and its ability to produce stuff more efficiently than Nazi Germany. Uh, we just don't think of the UK as being the monstrous machine that Germany is because, Winston Churchill is not Adolf Hitler kind of thing.
mm.
And Adolf Hitler has been remembered as the great enemy of history. I'm not trying to be a revisionist. I'm not saying that he's not. He definitely was. And the Nazi machine was evil. But it is interesting that in the case of World War II, the case can be made that it was machine versus machine, and we're fortunate that our machine won.
Alright, so we have talked about machinery a lot so far. Why is this machinery idea so important? What is it that you have kind of been obsessed about, infatuated about?
I have been obsessed a little bit by this idea of machine. I've read this book recently. It's called Against the Machine on the Unmaking of Humanity by an author by the name of Paul Kingsnorth. Paul Kingsnorth, just a little bit about him in case people aren't aware. He is an ex Greenpeace guy, so he was an environmental activist. He in the 1990s was deputy editor of the Ecologist magazine. He was involved in the Free West Papua campaign. He actually lived with the West Papuans for a while. He's a really enigmatic and strange fella. I'll just say
Yeah.
that.
I was gonna ask, is he a bit of a go against the grain guy? Because he's, collected all sorts of labels and names for himself.
I'm just going to read. So this is from his website. This is what he says. These are the labels he's collected. So just a few of them: communist, anarchist, reactionary, crazy, collapsitarian, uh, soy boy, nativist, cave dweller, luddite, Anabaptist. Anabaptist. What is this? The 19th century.
Yeah.
Um, Left wing oikophile, eco socialist, eco fascist, Doomer, nihilist, lower middle class Ecotoff, and his personal favorite apparently is environmental activist turned apocalyptic mystic. Um, so yeah, he
Eco Top, I think, is my favorite. Well, it
yeah.
sounds like there's some, wordy people who maybe have some things against this guy.
Do you know what?
Some good readers.
I love a British person with, a great vocabulary with these sort of insults. I just love a British wordy insult. There's something very, I think, comforting about
Yeah,
it.
I almost want one for myself. Like, can I be woolly liberal or soy boy? Like
You could be a rock climbing, skateboarding surf toff. I don't know if
yeah, it
that
just doesn't
works.
have the stuff off there, maybe.
Surf toff?
Yeah, I'm just
I don't
a
know. That could
competitive
be that
English
could be a
person.
it could be a deeply upsetting pejorative. That could be a really bad insult. I don't even know, you know?
I don't know what a toff is, so
I don't I don't
uh-uh.
either. And I'm not gonna look it up. So that's a bit about who people say he is. So he calls himself a conservative hippie, uh, an orthodox Christian anarchist, or a reactionary radical. So
So he's given some names for himself.
I know. So when I think of reactionary, I don't think of a radical. I think of a deeply conservative sort of God save the king kind of bloke. But then he calls himself as well an orthodox Christian anarchist. And this is kind of, I think, where the pieces all kind of come together in a weird, bizarre way. He is, on the one hand, a ex greeny kind of type. He admits that, but now he is orthodox Christian, which is weirdly having a resurgence in the West. It's like kind of like the almost like the cool
Trendy.
Christianity.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
it's 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 mystic, it's ancient, it has its roots in, the very beginning of it's kind of like if Catholics were cool and had, long beards instead of rosaries. I don't know. Maybe
Mm.
Orthodoxes have rosaries. I'm not sure. We should talk to some Orthodox people. I think that'd be
Yeah,
fun.
bring him on. I've seen his most recent book on the shelves. It's called, and I think I've heard you talk about it. I've read your articles where you've talked about it. Against the Machine on the Unmaking of Humanity is his
Yeah.
latest book.
The central argument to the book is simply this. He has this idea of what he calls the machine. And it's not an original idea. If you read the book, you'll see that he's developed it from some philosophical traditions that date back to the late 19th century, early 20th century. But essentially, he believes this machine. So the machine he basically refers to, the definition of it would be the system of technological progress that most of us take for granted and is a system that is self perpetuating, self aggrandizing, and is leading us to a very certain and specific future. And the reason this is relevant is because, in some ways, as we've been talking about AI in this series, this is kind of the philosophical extrapolation slash summary of all the things that we've been talking about, whether it's AI 2027 or Palantir, especially the annihilation slash enslavement futures that AI 2027 talks about. All of those things are part of the machine. And those futures, I'm pairing these together because I think he would say that those are pretty much the endpoint, the most practical endpoint that we can get to the machine.
Is he alluding to kind of like slaves to the machine, as in slaves to the screen, slaves to the echo chamber? Like, is he looking at it, us being slaves to kind of like the technology we have, or is he looking at it in the broader picture of AI and what is to come?
Mm. So when he says machine, he means a lot of things. So he means the iPhone that we have in our pockets. He means the social media platforms that spy on us constantly. He means the AI systems that are rapidly developing. But he also means the philosophical and political systems that have enabled these things to emerge. So he goes back to the Industrial Revolution, where he talks about the Luddites and these sort of anti-capitalist things. He talks about political theory. and the neoliberal way that we have embraced in the West for capitalism ever since the 50s and the 60s. But he also talks about things like wokeism and leftist ideology, socialism. He talks about fascism and the sort of far right movements. In fact, I will just quickly share this. He says if the machine has an ideology, um, I suggest that these four notions, which we'll talk about in a minute, are a fair summary. But then he goes on to say liberalism, socialism, communism, fascism, nationalism, all of these post Enlightenment forms could be said to be the result of what the historian John Bossie has called the migration of the holy from the church to the state. So, in other words, the way that the machine has separated us from the things that have rooted us, and we'll talk about roots in a minute because this is vital to his argument. The way the machine has uprooted us has allowed it to perpetuate itself throughout uh, many different cultures to the point where we are now unconscious of its influence on us.
This isn't just a modern day what the iPhone has done to us kind of thing. It's looking at like a centuries of progress that has kind of gotten us here, that has
Yeah.
kind of taken us away from culture, God, our humanity.
Yeah, so he actually starts with the French Revolution. This
Mm,
is the first thing because what the French Revolution does in France is well, it does a number of things. So the first thing it does is it um, essentially purges a great amount of the country from its churches, its clergy. It's incredibly anti-religious, anti-Catholic. And of course, Catholicism and the aristocracy are the two things that the revolution were primarily against. They saw them as being indulgent and tyrannical and exerting inordinate amounts of influence over French people. But in doing so, Kingsnorth argues that the French Revolution uprooted France from what made it France, from what made its people who they were. And so this is the beginning of the uprooting process, which continues ever since then. Because of course, revolutions like the American Revolution is very much based on the French system, and similar liberal democracies around the world find their roots in these forms of democracies with representative forms of government and progressive Enlightenment thinking ideas and so on and so forth.
and as a result, we've become cogs in this giant machine we've had no control over.
Yeah, yeah. So his core to his argument is what he calls the four Ps. So he believes the machine has uprooted us. He says that the machine has uprooted us from the past, so where we come from, our history, our ancestry, being able to trace a lineage of my grandfather was such and his grandfather was in such and such, etc. Um, and going along with that is people. Who are we? So my grandfather was such and he belonged to such and such a tribe from that kind of part of the world, and this is what we believe. And then of course going along with that is place. So where we are from, the local and particular manifestation of my particular culture. So, am I Irish? Am I Pictish? Am I Scottish? Am I, Zimbabwean? Ugandan, having a sort of connection to the land, I guess. In
Mm,
Australian Indigenous culture, there's definitely more of a connection to the land. In New Zealand Maori culture, it's called kaitiaki. Being a guardian of the land, actually being able to say, this is my mountain, this is my river, that is my ocean, kind of thing. And then finally, connected to all this is prayer. So essentially, a culture's religion. What do we believe? And how is that what we believe connected to the other things, our place, our people, and our past? So um, he talks about the fact that these four things are essentially what root us. So they give us a foundation for understanding who I am, where I've come from, and what my purpose in the world is. Um, and he makes the argument that for thousands of years, at least for the last 2,000 years in the UK, he's British, so this is very much kind of an expression of his background. he says that this has been Christianity. So Christianity has been the anchoring point that has helped to inform people's ideas of past, people, place, and prayer. And that one of the things that Enlightenment does, and that the French Revolution and everything that kind of comes from that, the rise of new atheism, neoliberalism, modern culture, is uprooting us from those things which has rooted us in the past. And he sees the attacks on Christianity in particular as being part of that uprooting process.
So past, people, place, and prayer. I think some of those I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that's important." Like, we've really drifted a long way from that. And then other ones, like, maybe I think of place and I'm like, "Oh, yeah," like, maybe it's just something I haven't dwelt on enough because the loss of, like, a place to a land doesn't
Mm,
seem super significant to me. Like, I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I came from Sydney and I'm from the Fletcher family." That's all I got. Um, but, yeah,
yeah.
it's just interesting, like, how far we've kinda drifted from that, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess this is part of our challenge as
Mm,
being an immigrant nation. Um,
mm,
and, we're a nation that's only 200-300 years old in the grand
mm,
scheme of things. I mean, the United Kingdom has been around for thousands of years in various forms. And so that sense of place is, I think, much more viscerally felt than maybe you would. I'm somebody who's moved around my entire life.
mm,
I wasn't born here. I have no real family or cultural connection to the land that I currently reside on. But I do know that there are people here who do.
mm.
And, particularly for Indigenous folks, I think this is probably way more important and easy to identify with than perhaps you and I.
Yeah.
And I guess as well, probably this is just a symptom of the machine.
Now Kingsworth kinda argues that we've almost, like, replaced
Yeah.
these 4 Ps with 4 Ss, he calls them.
Yeah.
What are these 4 Ss? Can you talk us through that?
Yeah. So he says that these have supplanted the four Ps in our modern mind. The first one is science. So instead of a more mythicized version of where we've come from and why we're here, as in the Christian understanding of the Genesis story and the story of the Old Testament, he says science offers us a non-mythic version of our origin story and asserts a claim to the true, i.e., measurable nature of reality. So, to Kingsnorth, if science can measure it, then it's true. If it cannot be measured, it's not true. Um, Second is the self. So, this is the highest good. This is who we are. The highest good is to serve the self and ensure its longevity. And I guess there's a lot more we could say on the self and how much of our culture is structured around the preservation and the glorification of the self. But I don't know, I feel like I'd be preaching to the choir there a little bit.
Yeah, I think we
um,
can see probably, like, Brian Johnson's influence that, but not even that. I think
yeah.
what people call it ageism, I guess the fear of growing old and all the beauty
Hmm.
products we buy into to kind of maintain this youthfulness, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
people
And
have caught up, but
it's
we're still caught up in it. It's a
yeah,
machine of its own.
it's the Clint Eastwood sort of rugged cowboy individualism. I am a unique person, self determination, all these sorts of things.
Mm.
So number three, then, sex. Interesting that sex is such a big part of this scenario. So he says sex is what we do. It is the highest means of sacral pleasure. So sacral being sacred, and through public expressions of sexuality and affirmation of individual identity. So sex is something that we do, but it is also something that is core to our identity. So our sexual identification, again, going back to the individual self and the finding myself, who is my true self, all these sorts of things. And then finally, and perhaps most frighteningly, the screen. This is where we are going, he says. The screen is both our main source of distraction from reality and the interface by which we are directed into the coming post human reality of the machine.
Yeah, I guess depending on who you talk to, some people might think that we've made great advancements and like profitable, not profitable, but, you know, exploring science and diving deeper into that has had good outcomes. Like, people would say we have, like, sexual freedom and liberation that we haven't had in the past. People would say that, it's good to focus on self, or the screen has given us connections and other things. So I'm sure that you would have, and I'm sure you've read into these articles or these, different opinions as well. People are on different sides of the fences when they come to these things, like whether they have been positive advancements or whether they've been negative advancements is
Mm.
quite controversial.
A lot of these, especially social media companies, really have preached this idea of increased connection and being able to be closer to your friends. As we're recording this, I think it's just come out that Instagram has been found liable to the
Mm,
degradation of teenagers' well-being, mental
yeah.
well-being. Whereas they have in the past been very, very zealous against saying that, yeah, no, we're not, this is not us, we're not doing anything wrong, essentially. But now uh, the jury's the jury's come home for this particular ruling. So I think that the conversation with this idea is about what we do with technology, and perhaps even more importantly, what it does to us. And when it comes down to it, we have a choice, not to bury the lead, because this is kind of where we're going to end. But we do have a choice in the way that technology is used and the way that it influences who we become. As a Christian, one of the things that has been invoked for millennia is this idea that God gives us in Genesis 1, verse 26, to exert dominion over the earth and everything on it, under it. Um, and this has often been interpreted throughout history as a mandate to exploit resources, to exploit other animals, to exploit the earth, and in some cases, exploit other people for the embetterment of ourselves. Uh, and I think it's really interesting that what this has done in many cases is created a sense of rootlessness and is an uprooting, especially since the argument that Kingsnorth argues is that we need a sense of belonging that is bigger than us across both time and space. And if we become a rootless society, we become adrift and open to capture by dangerous forces. And so when I think of both the idea of dominion that many people have interpreted in those very specific ways, but also just the way that technology that we interface with technology, um, it's almost like, to use religious language, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is constantly in front of us, and we have to choose whether we reach out and take that fruit or whether we choose something else. Um, and what we choose will inform what we become.
Can you extrapolate on that a little bit? Like, when you say choose the tree of good or evil, are you meaning like, because I know I've heard someone recently who he said, I have never in my life touched ChatGPT. Like, is it about like full resistance? Is it about like just saying no to advancements? Or is it like becoming wise and discerning with them?
I think the fact that you and I struggle to identify with some of those key markers of the things that root us to our community and our place, I think is indicative of the fact that the machine is working in some places that maybe we wish it weren't. So
Mm.
I think it's not just, as I've been thinking through these articles, as I've been writing them, and as I've been thinking about recording these episodes on them, I've been thinking, like, what's the point? You know, what a lot of what we're talking about here is very big and overwhelming stuff. I mean, unless Sam Altman or Elon Musk or Peter Thiel suddenly has a change of heart, you know, isn't this stuff just going to happen anyway, regardless of whether we want it to or not, whether we are opposed to it or not, whether we have figured out the right philosophical, spiritual perspective on it? And to a certain degree, I think that it's a lot of it is inevitable, in as much as you and I can have influence over it. But I think the deeper danger and the thing that we can control, and perhaps where this idea can hit us in a way that actually matters, is in us forgetting who we are as humans. And we live in a post-Christian society in our nation. And if you were to ask the average Australian, you know, the deep questions about who am I, where am I going, where have I come from, what am I here for? I think the rootlessness, that the uprooting that the machine has done in our lives, um, means that you'd get all sorts of different answers. And maybe some of those answers would be good and well thought through, but I think a lot of them will just be based on vibes, or how I'm feeling that day, or what I saw on TV or what I saw on TikTok, not actually connected to anything real. And so for me as a Christian, I do believe that my existence and the future of my species and my world, um, is determined by something bigger than myself. It's determined by God. That when I think of who I am, the ultimate answer is not how I feel or how I relate to you or anybody else. It's actually been written by God Himself. And that is my anchor point for my identity, my purpose, and for where I'm going. So I think the central question that we have to ask in this age of AI isn't what will the machines become? It is what will we become?
So it's like remembering that we're not cogs in the wheel. It's coming back to that. I don't know if identity was in his, well, there wasn't an I's, it was R's and P's or something, P's and S's.
Yeah.
But coming back to our identity, that we are men and women made in the image of God, or even if people aren't Christian, that they are people of value, that they are people with authority and choice, but not
Mm,
just slaves to the system, which we can kind of fall into thinking it from time to time.
yeah. So I think that for me, as I've been thinking through this and thinking through what does, resistance look like, I think that it's probably not protests, though if people want to protest this stuff and it actually moves the dial, then I'll be glad for that. For me, I think though it's about making intentional choices. Um, I still use AI for various things. It is practical, but I am trying to use AI more sparingly, and I'm trying to engage with these systems more sparingly. I think it's prioritizing those things that root us, that give us a deeper sense of purpose. So, going back to those 4 Ps, where do I come from? What is my past? Um, who are my people? Who's my tribe? Where do I come from in terms of DNA and ancestry? Um, what is my place? I've been thinking about this a lot because I was born in Sydney. I've lived in Western Australia. I've lived in Victoria. I've lived in New Zealand. And now I work across the road from where I was born, but don't really have much of a connection to that place. So, what is my place? That's it's a really difficult one for me. Um, and then, how is my spiritual life, my religious life root me? What does that say about who I am and what I'm here for? Uh, one of the things that, man, one of the things that we could talk about is the fact that we belong to a denomination that's been around for about, little less than 150, 200 years, but we are also connected to a wider Christian tradition that's been around for 2,000 years. And we often, in our own tradition, don't really acknowledge that. We kind of want to get away from that in many cases, but we are part of a fraternity, a brotherhood, of sisterhood that is uh, been around for much longer than us.
Well, I feel like this article in the series of articles was at least hopeful for me, because some of the other articles, they were kind of looking at the realities of the future that could potentially come from artificial intelligence, and from all these inventions and things. And sometimes I guess it can feel like, oh, we're just swept up in this, like we have no chance against these geniuses that have invented these systems and creating things with AI. But I really like how you ended in your article. I just want to read a section because I think it's just something good for us to kind of dwell on and center ourselves in. But you said, the real question facing us in the age of AI is therefore not merely what machines will become, but what humans will choose to be. If we are to avoid becoming cogs in the machine, we will need to rediscover our roots in communities that know our names, in traditions that ground us, and in a faith that reminds us that human dignity cannot be engineered. So yeah, I think that's some good ways to kind of like resist the system. Like we're always going to have communities we can root ourselves in. We're always going to have, you know, I guess a faith perspective or an angle on life that can remind us of who we are. We don't just have to kind of like follow along with what's going on.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself, even though
You
I
said
kind
it
of did.
yourself.
Well, hey, Zanita, thank you for embarking on this voyage with me. If you would like to listen to the other episodes in this series, if you haven't for any reason done that, you need to go back and listen to them. They will be in the show notes. The articles upon which these episodes were based have also been published in the March, April, and May issues of Science of the Times magazine, the year of our Lord, 2026. You can also find a link to those in the show notes. We will be back next episode with something completely different, and Zanita will be grateful for that, as will I. But either way, thank you, Zanita.
No problem. Thanks for taking us on the journey, Jesse.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening or watching. We will see you again soon. Goodbye.